done with casting pearls amongst the swine. 'Cause each of us is running out of time. It's already started silent, you won't hear a chime. You'll be measured and punished for each heavenly crime.
Hello and welcome to the Belfast Bapcast. Today we have with us Mark Devlin, music industry insider who reveals the dark occult underpinnings of the industry. So unfortunately Mark doesn't have much time today, so we're just going to get stuck straight in. I'm going to remove myself from the podcast, and Mark's just going to give a presentation on just the underpinnings of the music industry. So, Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. And
no worries, mate. Glad to be on.
And just let me know when to go on to the next slide. So, sure. I'll just go off screen now. So, 1 second.
All right. So, I'll just briefly introduce myself by saying that I'm a former club and radio DJ. I still do a little bit of DJing, but mainly just summer festivals and such. And I did that job for about 20 years full time. And things got to around about 2007, where I started to have some big questions about what was really going on in this world and who really ran things. And I got into conspiracy research, and I learned all about secret society networks and how every aspect of organized society is controlled by the same hierarchical power structure. And I realized that this must, of course, play out into entertainment and popular culture, and particularly music, because of the fantastic opportunities that those vehicles bring for mass mind control and the pushing of social engineering agendas. So I delved into that, and that became my full-time area of research, my niche. And I've been doing that now for the best part of 20 years. It's the 10th anniversary of my first Musical Truth book. And the first volume in 2016 brought together 5 years worth of research into the true nature of this industry. And I've since written 3 more books in that series and done a ton of presentations, so many podcasts, interviews, don't even know how many, probably into the thousands now. So yeah, I guess you could say I'm pretty immersed in this stuff, and it's kind of second nature for me to talk about it. So what we've got here is some slides from my Music's Military and Mind Control Connections presentation, which I've taken out on the road many times. And the first clue that something is not right is there in the title, because why should there be any connection whatsoever between the military and mind control and music? If music is all about fun and entertainment and just enjoying yourself during your leisure time, you wouldn't expect to find any of these elements there. But when you do get into the research, and when you read what I've presented in my books, and many other researchers have as well, and they've put out documentary films and YouTube videos and such, you come to realize that the military industrial complex has a major interest in music and popular culture. And also, unfortunately, you get aspects of the dark occult, and specifically Satanism. And this is because the controllers of organized society, and that's every aspect of it, from politics to academia to science to the military to the mainstream media to big business to tech, all the way through to entertainment, are at their core dark occultists, and they adhere to certain ritualistic belief systems. And however fantastic and outrageous that sounds to somebody upon first hearing, if you approach the research with an open mind and with no ulterior motive and no belief system to defend, you will find that this checks out. And you will find that there's no shortage of evidence to show that this is the case. So if we just advance the slides there, the first 2 were what I presented just before Halloween, or what's known as Samhain in the ancient pagan calendar. I just had a couple of kind of supernatural stories related to these records by Madonna and TLC. So I'll get into those another time. But if we just move on to the next one there, what have we got? Well, if you just go back one to the TLC, I'll just tell that story very briefly. So TLC were an R&B group in the 90s, consisting of 3 members, T-Boz, Lisa Left Eye Lopez, and Chili. Had a few hits, including this one, Creep. Sadly, Lisa Left Eye Lopez died in 2002 in a car crash in Honduras. Lots of suspicious elements to it, as there are with so many music artist deaths. Things just don't stack up, and there's so many anomalies. And the interesting thing about this particular record is that I had it on 12-inch and I used to play it as a DJ out in the clubs all the time. And shortly after Lisa Left Eye's death, I pulled out my copy of the 12-inch single and it got ripped. The sleeve got torn. And you could see here the resulting sleeve has ripped off the face of Lisa Left Eye Lopez. And it's left the other two members who are still with us intact. Not only that, though, but if we look at the title of the record, it was originally called Creep. Now the C has been randomly ripped off, and we're left with Reap, as in the Grim Reaper took Lisa Left Eye Lopez. And people might say, if that was a one-off story, oh, it's just a coincidence. It's just one of those things that occurs. But is it really? Because I've got no end of stories like this. And it all goes to demonstrate that we are dealing with more than just this apparent physical 3D reality. There are spiritual, paranormal, supernatural elements to so much that goes on, and this plays out daily in the music industry, and there's so many examples of phenomena like this. So I just presented that story to make the point, really. So on to the next one. That's just a selection of my books. Beyond that, that's my latest book, No One's Dad's a Plumber. So let's start here. My research pretty much takes me back to 1955. You got to start somewhere, right? So this was the birth of the modern rock and roll era, and it paved the way for what was to come in the 1960s with the whole sex and drugs and rock and roll lifestyle thing. So I feel that the foundations for all of this were laid by initially this record, Bill Haley and His Comets. It was called Rock Around the Clock, a very revolutionary record at the time in 1955, because prior to that point, in both Britain and America, society was very kind of grey and austere and quite drab. It was the post-war era. And what happened in the mid-1950s was there was this sudden injection of colour and energy and vibrancy. And it was all aimed at the youthful market of the time. Because when it comes to social engineering, fomenting attitudes and thought patterns and behaviors among large numbers of the general public, which aids some kind of agenda to be pushed along, these are always aimed at the young people of the time, because young hearts, minds, and souls are much easier to manipulate and they're much more malleable than when you get to my kind of generation. At my sort of age, you're a bit, cynical and world weary and jaded, but young people, full of hope and full of belief in life, are so much easier to manipulate. So we had this amazing record, Rock Around the Clock, which was so different to anything that had gone before. And also that year, we had three very key movies, again, all aimed at the youth market. James Dean, the poster child, the icon of that whole generation, Rebel Without a Cause. Of course, he died young, one of so many in entertainment that did. The Blackboard Jungle and the movie version of Rock Around the Clock. And these were all reinforcing notions of what it was like to be a teenager. Because up to that point, the mid-1950s, the word teenager was not in common parlance in society. So it was all part of preparing American society and then British and then the rest of the world for what was to come in the 1960s. When we look at some of those very early record labels that we've all heard of, we find endless connections into the world of the military. Here's the first of so many. Here's a good example, RCA, which stands for the Radio Corporation of America. And this was developed directly out of the US Navy. And prior to becoming a record label, it was concerned in sonic research. What could be achieved by the manipulation of sound, radar systems, sonar systems, radio technology, things of this nature. Then it became a record label and it released, among others, Elvis Presley. Next slide. We find pretty much the same story with EMI over in Britain, Electrical Mechanical Industries. This, of course, was the label that put out the Beatles and then later Pink Floyd and so many other big bands. Similar connections to the military industrial complex. There's some of the links there when you go back into the history. And it's the same with Parlophone, Decca, Thorn EMI, and so many of these other labels that put out the first rock and roll superstars. Next slide. Elvis Presley, arguably the first rock and roll superstar. So Bill Haley came along in 1955 with that very revolutionary record, and that was the birth of rock and roll culture. And then the following year, 1956, Elvis Presley comes along. He was pictured there with his handler, Colonel Tom Parker, who wasn't a real colonel. He was a Dutchman who arrived in America in very dubious circumstances with a very sketchy backstory. And there's much evidence to show that Colonel Tom Parker was actually Elvis Presley's mind control handler. Here's another candidate for that role, Jimmy Savile. It seems that if you wanted to be successful in those early days of the industry, you had to have an affiliation with Sir. Let's not forget the Sir bit, because that's important. Jimmy Savile. So there's Elvis with Jimmy. There's Jimmy Savile with Sir Cliff Richard. So they do say birds of a feather flock together, don't they? Cliff Richard's got a dubious past as well. There are connections there with the Cray twins. There's connections with Lord Bob Boothby, Tom Dryburgh, who was a Labour MP at the time. And all of these characters were involved in scandals involving the P word, children. We know what we're talking about here. Sir Jimmy Savile with Sir Mick Jagger. You know, we're starting to see a trend emerging here, aren't we? All Sirs together. Who's next? Here's Jimmy Savile with the Beatles. Sir Jimmy with Sir Paul McCartney, as he is now. That's Paul McCartney 1.0. Don't worry, we'll get into that. And Sir Ringo Starr, you know, Ringo's a Sir these days. What is it about the Beatles that made them the most successful, influential, and popular band of all time, over and above all other competitors? Well, here are the two key members of that group, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, lauded as the greatest singer-songwriter duo of the 20th century, and they're giving it a certain handshake. Now, I'm not a Freemason myself, even though I've been accused of being so, but from what I'm led to believe, that is a Masonic handshake. And if Paul and John were indeed Masons, this would go a long way to explaining why their group was chosen to be just as influential as it was. Here's another dubious hand signal. We've got Paul and John, the key members of this group. You know, Ringo and George at the front aren't really doing much, but Paul and John are putting their hands inside their jacket. And this is a method of occult signaling within certain groups, not least Freemasonry, the secret society network. And it denotes the hidden hand. It's an indicator that these people are part of the club and you're not. Here's an interesting image of Paul McCartney, the original one, with his head inside a bird cage. This at the time was explained away as an avant-garde art statement, part of the counterculture in Britain at the time. But I think there's more going on here, because the controllers of these industries do like to announce their true nature and tell you what's really going on in the form of symbolism. So you have to become symbol literate to know what's being communicated by these things. So if we just go back to that birdcage one, what this is really indicating is that Paul has been subject to mind control. And this is another consistent factor in entertainment. We find it in Hollywood movies just as much as we do in the music industry. So many of these household name favorites, A-listers, names we've all heard of, will have been subject to MK Ultra style trauma-based mind control programming, which causes their minds to dissociate from reality and shatter into different compartments, components, or alters, each of which can be programmed with their own individual personality. And this is part of what keeps them in line. It keeps them pushing agendas. It keeps them staying on script and away from exercising their own thoughts and putting across their own ideas on things. That's why handlers are inserted into their lives to keep an eye on things and to make sure that they're staying on script. Occasionally, we get examples of artists whose mind control programming starts to break down. And that's when they start to become a threat because they start speaking out and saying things that aren't necessarily approved. And then certain measures have to be taken to control the situation. That's when we see certain artists unfortunately taken out in various dubious circumstances, or in some cases, they go back to the lab, the mind control lab, to have their programming topped up before they then get re-released into the public. So on the next slide, we can see the original Paul McCartney. I would argue that's what we're looking at here, with his girlfriend, Jane Asher. So she was a child star who became an actress. She was big news in the 60s. Her father, who's pictured here on the left, was Dr. Richard Asher, and he was a psychiatrist who was attached to the Central Middlesex Hospital in London. And he wrote a paper in the 1950s on hypnosis and dream states, deep sleep states. So this was the area of work that he was interested in. And he left his post at the hospital and then based himself at the family home in Wimpole Street, W1, London. Paul McCartney moved in to the family home to be with his girlfriend Jane and lived there for an extended period in the 1960s. So it was the Asher family home, but also Dr. Asher's clinic where he conducted his work. Dr. Asher's wife was Margaret Elliot, coming from the same bloodline family as T.S. Eliot, and family bloodlines are very important to this story in terms of how certain famous people get selected for their roles. It's all down to genealogy and ancestry. So Margaret Elliot was a music teacher, and among others, she taught Sir George Martin, the Beatles producer, known as the Fifth Beatle, to play the oboe. She was very familiar with classical and world music. Paul McCartney's most famous song is said to be Yesterday, and he's credited with having come up with the melody in his sleep. He says that one morning he woke up and the tune was there, and he didn't really know where it had come from. On YouTube, and I put a link to it in my book, there is an Italian musician named Lily Greco, and he's performing an Italian aria from 1895. I forget the name of it. It's in Italian. My Italian isn't too great. But the melody to this song is almost identical to Yesterday. So what if Margaret Elliot, being familiar with world music, she probably would have known about Italian music, like this 1895 aria. What if, as part of her husband, Dr. Richard's experiments into what could be achieved through hypnosis and deep sleep states, implanted that melody into a sleeping McCartney's mind, to the point that when he woke the following morning, he thought he'd just composed it out of nowhere, but actually he'd had it implanted into his subconscious. I feel that's what went on with that particular song. Footnote to the Dr. Asher story. In 1969, Paul had split from his relationship with Jane. We're told that Jane arrived home one day and found Paul in bed with Linda, who became Linda McCartney. Her maiden name was Linda Eastman. She was a photographer from America, and the original family name, before it got Americanized to Eastman, was actually Epstein. So she was Linda Epstein. And so she went on to marry Paul, and that was in March of 1969, which was the same month that John Lennon married Yoko Ono. And according to many researchers, Yoko was fulfilling the role of John Lennon's mind control handler. She was inserted into his life to keep close tabs on him. So by this point, 1969, I would argue there had been two Paul McCartneys. We are getting to this. But if we look at these two pictures here, on the right, we've got Paul and Jane, and they're roughly the same height. On the left, we've got Paul 2.0, who's towering above Jane. This is because we're looking at two different men, two separate individuals. So just to round off the Dr. Asher story, In spring of 1969, Dr. Asher went missing. The family searched the house from top to bottom, including the basement. He's nowhere to be found. Round about a week later, he turns up in the basement, dead. Verdict: suicide. It seems Dr. Asher had outlived his usefulness, and it serves as a reminder that if you affiliate yourself with psychopaths and Satanists, you should never be that surprised if one day they decide they don't need you anymore and they throw you under a bus. Just ask Sean P. Diddy Combs about that one. So if we just move on here, we've got what I would argue is two separate individuals. I mean, if you presented either of those pictures to the average member of the public and said, "Who's this?" they'd say, "Well, it's Paul McCartney." But it's not until you put them side by side that you start to see some obvious differences and discrepancies. Next one. So the whole idea, and this is a conspiracy theory which has persisted within music industry research for decades, is that in 1966, and the date that's most often given for it is September 11th, so it's 9/11/66. These occultists love communicating through numbers. It's a big part of their cryptic communication system. The idea is that the original Paul McCartney died in a car crash. It's very difficult to find any verifiable evidence that this was the case, but there are certainly a lot of cryptic coded clues. And we also have this book, which came out initially in 2009. It's called The Memoirs of Billy Shears. There have been various versions of it. There's also a sister publication called Billy's Back. And it's credited to an individual named Thomas E. U. Harriot. It purports to be the tell-all autobiography of the individual that's been playing the public role of Paul McCartney ever since 1966. His name is given as William Shepherd, or William Shepherd Campbell, and he's said to be a Scotsman, known colloquially as Billy Shears. This is why on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, which was released in spring 1967, a few months after the switch is alleged to have taken place, you've got the line, "So may I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears." In many of my talks, I've presented so much video evidence to suggest that the individual we have playing the role of Paul McCartney today is actually named William or Billy. So I think we've got one next. We'll see if the video is going to play. Not sure if it will. Yeah, we've got no sound there, I think. But what's happening is this is Paul McCartney meeting Olivia Harrison, who is George Harrison's widow, and also his son Danny. And Olivia greets him by saying, "Hello, Billy." When you can hear the audio, it's quite clear she's saying Billy for some reason. That's a bit strange, isn't it? If his name's Paul. And we've got another one here. This is Dana Carvey, who's the actor who was in Wayne's World. And he's relating an anecdote about a time that he met Paul McCartney. And he goes on about how he commended Paul for this particular album that he liked, his solo album of 1980 with this song Tug of War. And then he goes on to say, "I think with Billy," so it's like a Freudian slip, because the person he's talking about is named Billy, I would argue. And I know people will say it's absolutely preposterous to suggest that that's not the original Paul McCartney. How could they have switched him out? Why didn't the family say anything? Why was nothing done at the time? If you read the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, it does a really great job of explaining all of that. So if anyone is doubting and is skeptical about how this could have taken place, I recommend reading that book. Also, have a look at the work of Mike Williams, known as Sage of Quay, because Mike has done a ton of deep dives and exposés into different aspects of McCartney and this guy who would appear to be named William Shepherd or Billy Shears. If you head to Mike's Paul is Dead YouTube channel or his Sage of Quay channel, you'll find a whole load of videos there. This picture is of a young Yoko Ono. We just go back to that one with Linda Eastman, original name Epstein. And Linda grew up in a town named Scarsdale in Westchester County, New York. The interesting thing about this town is it's also where a young Yoko Ono was based when her father, who headed up a large Japanese banking dynasty, came over from Japan to the States and chose to base himself in Scarsdale. So you've got two young women who would go on to marry the lead members of the most influential music group of all time, both growing up in the same obscure town in New York State. And I would argue from that there's a lot more to know about what goes on in Scarsdale. It's probably a hub of mind control activity and possibly satanic ritual abuse, because these things go hand in hand and we find them everywhere in the music industry. Yoko is descended on her mother's side from the one-time emperor of Japan. So she's Japanese royalty. And this is another great example of family bloodlines and why certain people are selected for key prominent roles in society. It's all down to the families that they're born into. And I would contest that Yoko was put into John Lennon's life as his mind control handler. I think John was a great example of somebody who was obviously mind controlled, but his programming started to break down in the 1970s. And Yoko was there, along with other parties, to try and get him back on track. And I would also contend that they eventually took John Lennon out because he was too much of a threat and he couldn't be controlled, he couldn't be relied upon, he'd become a loose cannon, and so he had to go. We've got George Martin here, or Sir George Martin, and prior to becoming the Beatles' key producer, he worked at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop in London. And this place was all about sonic manipulation, exploring what could be achieved by tinkering around with sound and sound frequencies. What is interesting is that the Beatles, after late August 1966, when they played their final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, became a studio-only band. So from that point on, beginning with the Sgt. Pepper album, they just stayed in the studio and got more and more ambitious with what they were doing with sound, largely at the hands of George Martin. But this, of course, tallies with the idea that we weren't looking at the original Paul McCartney anymore. So a good way of keeping that switch under wraps would have been to not have the Beatles performing live anymore, so that any discrepancies in height between the new Paul and the other members could not be obviously noticed. What's next? Okay, so this was a very key piece of work by the American author and researcher Dave McGowan. This book came out in 2014. It's titled Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And Dave was someone who was interested in 60s music, mid to late 1960s, the soundtrack to the counterculture of those times. And he did a bit of a deep dive into many of these bands, many of these artists. And he realized that for some reason, they were coming from all over America, Canada, and even beyond, and flocking to this one particular neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills overlooking Los Angeles. It was known as Laurel Canyon. There was no ostensible reason for this because there were no music clubs, no recording studios, no record labels based there. What there was in the vicinity was a covert military research base, which was used for producing propaganda films on behalf of the American military and government, called Lookout Mountain. And he thought that was a little strange. And then he started delving into the family backgrounds of many of these key musicians. And he found a disturbing trend emerging. Without exception, the fathers of these prominent musicians who shaped and molded the cultural attitudes of the time through music had high-level connections to the world of the military or military intelligence or various government departments. And the best example we have of this dynamic, and it's by no means an isolated one, is Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors. So here he is pictured with his old man. His dad was Admiral George Stephen Morrison, and he was the Navy Admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag PSYOP. And this was the event that was used to justify America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, Jim is hailed as a poster child, as an icon of the anti-war, anti-establishment generation of the time. And he's representing all the youthful angst and the contempt that young people had at the time towards their parents' value systems. How do we reconcile these two things? So Jim's out there on stage pushing sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and against the man, anti-establishment, and his old man effectively started the Vietnam War. Like I say, this is very far from an isolated incident, and in that book, Dave McGowan documents the family links of so many of these people. Let's just move on to the next one there. So this is a piece of video, and it's a very young Jim Morrison, a year before he emerged as the frontman of The Doors. This is 1964, and it's a commercial for Florida State University. Jim is there as a student, looking very clean-cut and scholarly, and it's an acting job because Jim Morrison was an actor. This was his gig in 1964. In 1965, it switched and he'd become the front man of The Doors. What we got next? Similar dynamic with Bob Marley, and I'm not about to suggest that Bob Marley was necessarily a controlled asset. I think it's quite possible that he was that rarest of entities, a genuine, sincere artist who was putting out message music. But when we look into his dad, we find a similar detail there to Jim Morrison's. There he is in the middle, Norvell Sinclair Marley. He was a white British naval officer, and he also ran a slave plantation in Jamaica. You couldn't make it up. And that's Bob's mother there on the right. So I believe that Bob Marley was eventually taken out by the CIA. There was an attempt on his life in 1976 in a shooting incident, but he survived that. Later on, though, I think he was targeted for removal because he was having just too much of an uplifting and positive impact on the public, on his listeners. And we can't have that. So it's similar to what they did with John Lennon. John Lennon was removed in December 1980, and by May 1981, Bob Marley had been taken out as well. We're told that he died from a form of cancer, which had spread through his toe, which he broke when he was playing football. But there is more to the story, and I detail that in my book, Musical Truth, Volume 1. So this is Frank Zappa, who was another prominent musician based in Laurel Canyon in those times. And we find that his father, who's pictured here, worked on biological weapons research at the Edgewood Arsenal military base in Maryland. And Frank Zappa's wife, Gail Sloatman, attended naval kindergarten with a young Jim Morrison. So they all knew each other. It was one big interlinked community. And they're all based in Laurel Canyon because of the military connections of that place. What was being done in the 1960s was a systematic exercise in social engineering, and it was designed to break up the traditional family unit and replace it with new attitudes towards everything: sex, drugs, rock and roll, family relationships. You had all these other social changes going on at the time. LSD and other psychedelics were arriving in unending quantity, and there's so much evidence to demonstrate that all the drugs were coming through the CIA supply lines. Here's Dr. Timothy Leary, and he endorsed that whole thing. He was like the poster child for LSD and psilocybin mushrooms, mescaline, and all these other compounds that were getting pushed and endorsed at that time. And Leary's message was that his students, these young people, should go on these amazing journeys of self-discovery, expand their consciousness through the use of psychedelics. This occurred at exactly the same time as all the music was changing, not just music coming out of Laurel Canyon and out of San Francisco, but over in Britain, you had a lot of psychedelic music, trippy, sort of out there music. The Beatles' music changed around about 1966. Early Pink Floyd were very trippy and psychedelic, and even Status Quo, when they first started out, before they became this more bluesy sort of band, they were dabbling in experimental psychedelic styles. Gloria Steinem, pictured here, she pushed what's come to be known as modern feminism. She was all about promoting the birth control pill. She was all about getting women into the workplace and saying, you know, women can do jobs just as well as men. But this was all part of social engineering as well. And the idea here was getting women out of the home, out of their traditional nurturing role with children, into the workplace where they could be contributing to the taxation system. And at the same time, they're putting their children into state-sponsored child so-called care at ever earlier ages. It's breaking up the traditional family unit and all the cohesion and unity that comes from that. That's what the whole 60s program was all about. And they wheeled out all their assets. Dr. Timothy Leary was on the payroll of the CIA. By his own admission, in later interviews that he gave, he basically confessed to having been a CIA asset. Gloria Steinem also. And this group, the Grateful Dead, who again were hailed as heroes of that whole counterculture scene. And they've got a fan base all around the world known as Deadheads. They think as a term of endearment, but this is how the dark occultists that run these institutions actually see the public. They see us as spiritually dead. So they love it when fans of this group refer to themselves as deadheads. And when you look into the members of the Grateful Dead, you find connections into the CIA, you find connections into Freemasonry and other secret society networks, not least Bohemian Grove, which is this gathering that occurs once a year in Northern California, where business leaders and rich and powerful people gather and take part in a ritual ceremony known as the cremation of care, where they don robes and they gather around a fire in front of a 40-foot effigy of a stone owl. Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead has confessed to being an attendee at Bohemian Grove. Why? Because he's in the club and he's doing the bidding of those that control these institutions. Another example of this link we have between so many prominent musicians and the world of politics. Dave Grohl, his father, James Harper Grohl, worked in politics as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. Robert's father was one of the American presidents, William Howard Taft, and his father, Alphonso Taft, was a founder of the Skull and Bones, a cult secret society operating out of Yale universities. So all these elements go hand in hand. Where you find military intelligence, you usually find links to Satanism and dark occult and different ritualistic practices. And unfortunately, there are other unsavory elements as well, like mind control, satanic ritual abuse, and the P word involving children. I wish it was some other way, but I'm just reporting on what I've found. I didn't make it this way. I'm just the messenger. And all this information checks out. I realize it sounds outrageous to people the first time they hear it, but read my books, read the books of many other researchers, look at the documentation, look at the evidence, listen to many of these people talking about this stuff themselves in video interviews. And the picture starts to form. It's undeniable. Obviously, it's kept out of the official version of events. You don't find this stuff on Wikipedia, but it's all out there if you know where to look. And I've got all the resources and citations at the end of all my chapters. So here's the Copelands. Meet the Copelands. This group had an absolute stranglehold on the punk and new wave scene in both Britain and America in the 1970s. So they ran various record labels and they had a booking agency. And of course, they had their house band, The Police, because in the center here, we've got one of the Copeland sons, Stuart Copeland, who was the drummer with the Police. On the left, you've got Ian Copeland, now deceased, and on the right, Miles Copeland Jr. And they're all the sons of a career CIA spy named Miles Axe Copeland. He worked for the agency for many decades, had postings all over the world. And these three sons were born in Beirut, which is a major CIA stronghold, and it seems they were all put to use in the music industry in various prominent roles. So they like to give the odd clue as to what they're all about. This is one of the tenets of these occultists. They seem to feel the need to place the truth in plain sight and tell you what they're up to and what they're all about. They do it usually in cryptic coded form, often involving numbers and symbolism, and they just expect you to be able to decipher all this stuff. But as far as they're concerned, they have told you. And there are different spiritual reasons as to why they do this. It goes into karmic retribution and consequentialism and their comprehension of the way the universe is constructed, basically, and how to manipulate energetically the way it's made up. So there was a holding company for their various operations, which they used to call Copeland International Artists, or CIA. They also had a company called Frontier Booking International, or FBI, and one called International Records Syndicate, IRS. And then, of course, there was their house band, The Police, as in their job was to police all the other acts coming through the punk and new wave scene and make sure that only the approved ones got through. They were gatekeepers. So that's The Police featuring Sting. What's a sting operation? It's one you never see coming and it takes you by surprise. Here's another group from the glory days of New Wave. This is Talking Heads out of New York. And we've got the husband and wife duo here to the left, Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth, who formed their own side project called Tom Tom Club. So let's have a look at some of the family connections of Tina Weymouth, because this tells us a lot. Next slide here. Tina Weymouth's brother Jan, Harvard graduate, turns out to have been chief of design for the Grand Louvre project in Paris, involving the placement of the iconic glass pyramid, which is a major calling card of Freemasonry. Next slide. Jan, her brother, and Tina's father, Ralph Weymouth, was a vice admiral of the US Navy. Here we go again, echoes of Jim Morrison here, and a master of the Freemason Grand Lodge of Maine. Their great-grandfather, meanwhile, known as the Bard of Brittany, was a poet and lecturer at Harvard and Yale. Anatole married Mabel Davidson, the sister to Henry Pomeroy Davidson, which brings a link to the Yale secret society Skull and Bones. Here we go again. Henry was a senior partner, just to go back there. Henry was a senior partner of the banking monolith JP Morgan, worked with the Astor Place Bank, and was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve System. So that's quite a lot of system/establishment links for a rock musician to have. This is why I titled my latest book, No One's Dad's a Plumber. And this goes back to Dave McGowan's work. Because when it comes to punk and new wave bands, and many of these acts from the heavy rock and heavy metal scenes, I would have expected to have found fathers who had regular working class jobs, builders, laborers, construction workers, dockers, plumbers. But you never find that. What you do find is fathers who were governors, lord mayors, lieutenant colonels, generals, admirals, Freemasons, politicians, diplomats, endless links back into the establishment. And the implication here is that so many of these musicians and these groups were put out there to do the bidding and push the agendas of the overriding control system that we have. That was their job. The music industry, or at least at its corporate level, is completely controlled. It's not there for fun and entertainment. It's not there to enrich your life. These people are not your friends. Many of them get hailed as heroes and icons and put up there on pedestals, but they're not your friends. You don't know these people. You don't really know where they've come from. So it pays to be mindful of that. I'm not saying don't listen to popular music. We all need music in our lives. All I'm saying is that it pays to be mindful of where these people came from, and the fact that a lot of these sounds and these songs and the artwork, even and the visuals, the symbolism, are pushing agendas, and they're placing ideas and perceptions and thoughts into the collective subconscious mind of the fan base. Once you become consciously aware of that, you effectively break that magician's sorcerer's spell. And the information gets pulled out of the subconscious, where it can be having that controlling effect on you without your knowledge, into the conscious mind, where it can be properly processed and comprehended. So, my main overriding message is that this is what people need to be doing when it comes to music. Don't throw it all out. I mean, you can if you want, but continue to enjoy it. Just be aware, be spiritually streetwise. So I mentioned earlier that it's all about family bloodlines, and that's where many of these famous people come from. We've got a great example of a family tree here, which has been drawn up by professional genealogists. And it's based around George Bush in the center there. And one way or another, he's related by blood to Dick Cheney, who recently passed away, his vice president, Barack Obama. We've got Marilyn Monroe in there. We've got the actors Tom Hanks and Brad Pitt. We've got Madonna, Celine Dion, all these people related one way or another as cousins. Camilla's in there. Let's move on. Here's another great example of the family bloodline stuff, and this comes straight from the horse's mouth. This is Esther Dawson, who was known as Jinx Dawson, and she was the singer with the group Coven, who were big in that psychedelic era in the late 1960s. They're still going, actually. I see they're still touring now. And they pushed blatantly Satanism and black masses. They've got an album called Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. And on the back cover to the album, you've got a depiction of an actual satanic black mass. That's what they're all about. Let's just move on. And this is Esther Dawson in her own words, explaining where she comes from. She says, "I'm of the Mayflower Society, a direct descendant of John Howland, the 13th signatory of the Mayflower Compact. My father was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and my grandfather, a former Lieutenant Governor of Indiana, was High Priest of the Royal Arch Masons." And there's some other links there. And she sums it all up by saying, "So I am steeped in American Illuminati." So that's why her group got promoted. We get fed Cinderella fairy stories to explain away where many of these people come from. Here's a great example of that. This is Madonna, and it's a monologue from her Virgin Tour video, which was released in 1985. I mean, we get a clue right there from the picture. There she is from the movie Desperately Seeking Susan, and on the back of her jacket, she's got a bloody great Masonic pyramid, complete with a capstone and an all-seeing eye. These are all symbolic calling cards of the secret society network, mainly Freemasonry. So she asks us to believe. I went to New York. I had a dream. I wanted to be a big star. I didn't know anybody. I wanted to dance. I wanted to sing. I wanted to do all those things. I wanted to make people happy. I wanted to be famous. I wanted everybody to love me. I wanted to be a star. I worked really hard and my dream came true. And this is what we're entrained to think in terms of where these people come from. That's all it takes, folks. You've just got to work really hard, have that dream, have that vision, never give up on it, and you too could be as big as Madonna or Beyonce or Rihanna or Taylor Swift. Doesn't actually work that way. In Madonna's case, it's all down to her family bloodline. That's the only reason she's successful. I mean, she's not the best singer in the world. There's many better than her, and she's certainly not the best actor in the world. The slab of concrete in my back garden could act better than Madonna, but it's not stopped her getting film roles because she's being promoted purely by virtue of the family bloodline that she comes out of. So when Lady Gaga first emerged as the next big thing in round about 2008, I heard a lot of people saying, "Oh, she reminds me of Madonna." Yeah, that's because they're cousins. She modeled her whole act on her cousin, Madonna. Moving on. Not just that family link. It turns out Madonna is also a cousin of Ellen DeGenerate, the chat show host. And the next one. Also, Madonna is related, and this is all coming through her mother's bloodline Her mother is French-Canadian Madonna Louise Fortin, and she's related to Justin Trudeau, it turns out, who's recently started dating Katy Perry, I see. Also related to Justin Bieber, and also Camilla, and Madonna is a cousin of Celine Dion. So you get the idea. All these people are related. That's why they're ushered into the public eye. Not just as singers. I mean, we've got politicians there, even royals, and of course, Hollywood actors. There they are. You've heard of them. That's the point. If they're a household name, if you could stop the average member of the public in the street and say, have you heard of such and such? And you know the answer 10 out of 10 times is yes, that's because they've been elevated there. These careers are facilitated and they're handed to these people on a plate. I mean, did George W. Bush become president of the United States because he was a brilliant politician? It's a rhetorical question. Next one. So this is the late, great George Carlin. And we can just play this. There's no sound, but you know what he's saying. It's a big club and you ain't in it. And neither would you want to be. So that's the point. And I guess we'll stop it there, Mark, because that's the first part of the presentation. There is a second part, which goes on a bit longer. And I see my image is terrible there because of the sun coming in. But I thought we would leave some time for any questions that you might have if you want to just ask me about any of this stuff or clarify any of those points. Let me try and correct this image a little bit because the sun is playing havoc with my picture there. But yeah, go ahead if there's anything you want to say or ask.
No, obviously, just thank you for your time. It was very self-explanatory as you went through it. We're currently going through like a 6-part series, like the layer of collapse of society, and it sort of mirrors very much in with the institutional side of things. You know, nothing is by chance and nothing in the mainstream is by chance. If it's being pushed, it's part of an agenda, and nobody articulates the musical side of that better than yourself. I've listened to you on many channels. I was actually last night I was watching you on, I think, Richard Vobes. And yeah, it's the depth that you go into as well. It's not even scratching the surface, but it's still enough depth to show people that all the signs are
yeah, exactly that. That really is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. I mean, I've got 4 books worth of this stuff, and I've spoken for I don't even know how many hours about it all.
Where can people connect with you? And I'm going to just ask you to send over all your links for your books and stuff, but where can people connect with you, social channels and stuff?
Sure. Well, all my books are on Amazon. So if you want to get them from there, you'll find Musical Truth Volumes 1, 2, and 3, and also No One's Dad's a Plumber. And I've got 2 allegorical novels on there as well, truth fiction, because I've tried my hand at writing fiction. Fiction is a great way of getting across truth bombs, and you can dress it up in the form of fiction. So you are communicating empowering information. But if anyone calls you up on it and says, that's a load of nonsense what you're saying there, you got plausible deniability because you can say, it's fiction, mate. Chill out. Come on, it's just a story. But it's more than
that's a great way of getting truth across.
Yeah. And I'm writing the 3rd one of that at the moment. So the books are on Amazon. But if anyone wants to get them from me direct, you could drop me an email to markdevlin2022 at protonmail.com, and I'll be happy to send out signed copies of those books. I've got a YouTube channel. Yep.
So why do you think currently the music industry has become so blatantly obvious with the symbolism and so overt as opposed to, do you think it's been because incrementally they've dripped it in and now it's just free reign, or is there an agenda behind the overtness of it now?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. They certainly are becoming more and more blatant with it. And it's either because they are so full of arrogance and hubris, and they have the rest of us down as being so spiritually ignorant and profane that they can literally rub our noses in all this stuff without us noticing, caring, or doing anything about it, that they're actually getting off on it. It's one of their tenets within their satanic ritualistic belief systems to, mock us to our faces. Or they're getting desperate because they realize that more and more people are getting wise to what they're all about and what all these different signs and symbols mean. That's my greatest hope, that
Yeah.
so many researchers out there have revealed so much about what goes into these music videos and the imagery and stuff, and particularly these live shows, US Super Bowl halftime show and the Grammys and the MTV VMAs, all these big shows, even the Eurovision these days, that are just pushing blatant satanic symbolism. These events have become rituals. They're mass energy harvesting rituals. And I do wonder if they're stepping it up more and more because they feel that they're losing, because more and more people are starting to notice. And it's only down to the work of researchers putting this stuff out. And I've learned from so many of them myself that this process is underway, and it just has to continue. And what I'd like to see happen more than anything else is more young people getting involved in this stuff, because I do a lot of talks, a lot of conferences, and I look out there in the audience, and the demographic is generally 50 to 70-year-olds. I very rarely see people under 40. And that's a shame, because it's young hearts, minds, and souls that all this stuff is directed at. And I would love more young people to be savvy and wise and clued up on all this stuff. There is some of that happening. You can look on TikTok and you can see videos where somebody's posted something exposing some music video and all the symbolism and stuff. And you get comments there like, oh yeah, that's a Baphomet sign, or that's a 666 sign, or that's a calling card of Freemasonry. So some young people are aware. I would just like to see more. I'd like it.
It's very alert, though. There's no fear around it. It doesn't appear like what you said there. It is that sort of blaseness. So that's just the Baphomet, that they don't seem to understand the layers that go beneath that. And you do a very good job of exposing that. And I know you're very short for time today, so I'd just like to thank you very much for taking time out and coming on the Bapcast. And hopefully we can have you back to do the part 2 at some stage.
Yeah, we probably should, because this is a presentation which I put together and I've delivered it live many times, and it's titled Music's Military and Mind Control Connections. So what we've just seen there is part 1. And when I deliver this live, I usually take a break at this point and then come back for part 2, because there's much more in there about predictive programming, more mind control symbolism, mind control generally, how trauma-based mind control and dissociation from reality works, and how that applies to many celebrities. So we can do part 2 at some time. There's just a lot there, and I don't really want to overwhelm people and unload too much information in one go.
We had Dr. Colnay Ross, the leading expert of mind control, trauma, and dissociation on, and it all ties in. It's just fantastic to be able to have yourself on, just to give the music side of things. So thank you very much. I'll let you get on, and I'll be in touch via email, and we'll set up part 2.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. Not a problem. Yep. It's been an absolute pleasure, and have a good day.
All right. Cheers.
So thank you guys for joining us, and obviously Mark for giving us time today. Very, very insightful, and I think it's pretty clear to see that there is more to the music industry, the film industry, and everything else that meets the eye. And as we're tying it all together in our 6-part series, you'll see. So thank you very much for joining us, and please like, share, and subscribe, and follow all Mark's socials, and we'll get him all his links in the description, etc. Thank you.
Only in the looking back at life are you able to discern that you were being crafted through every little concern. Flaws and trials attacked because you had a role. And this is why there's been a constant fight for your soul. The furthest into the world have been debauchery, iniquity was all I seen. The pleasure dome of dopamine is fleeting and devoid. Why we call it mental health and addiction, just to avoid. That is the consequence of sin, and their warnings to draw near to that place that is filled with uncertainty. But with him you lose all fear. Only in the looking back at life Are you able to discern that you were being crafted through every little concern? Forging trials attack because you had a role. And this is why there has been a constant fight for your soul. We choose the easy path because the thought of actual sacrifice makes us accept the false doctrines presented because it fits nice. It doesn't challenge your behaviors or teach you what is right. It divides you with theology and confusion. So all we do is fight, only in the looking back at life. Are you able to discern that you were being crafted through every little concern? Forged in trials attack because you had a role. And this is why there has been a constant fight for your soul. But as we are in the age of information, makes ignorance a claim of retardation. There is a war that is not of the physical dimension. Just no faith minus works will lead to spiritual annihilation. Only in the looking back at life are you able to discern that you were being crafted through every